So the first lecture that you're going to watch is on the Indian subcontinent, and we're just going to provide a brief overview of the ancient past beginning about 2000 BCE, that means before the Common Era, and running to about 1600 of the Common Era. A really quick overview. We're going to study ancient India in much more depth next 6 weeks, but this is just to give you a background so you know some of the cultural and religious tensions that exist that are going to make Indian independence a really tricky proposition in the 20th century. When we look at India's ancient past, we go back quite a few centuries, and in fact thousands of years, to find the earliest people that we know lived on the Indian subcontinent, and then the waves of people that came after. And that's really what the first part of this lecture is going to focus on. India's long history dates back certainly to about 2000 BCE, and in some parts of the Indian subcontinent, even 1,000 years or so before. We know, for example, that the first civilization on the Indian subcontinent really occurred around the Indus Valley. The Indus Valley people lived in established cities such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, more on those next 6 weeks, and they seem to have practiced a specific religion. They seem to have been really well organized. And let me give you some examples. The cities that have been excavated are organized on a grid system, okay? And what that means is that the streets run parallel to each other and then perpendicular to each other in really close to 90-degree angles. And that's amazing. That's incredibly early for such an organization. And in fact, we're not going to see that organization again until we hit the Roman Empire quite a bit later. We also know that these cities had sewage systems that took trash and waste out of the city, and they had systematic ways of gathering the harvest and then keeping it in store. So if a famine were to hit, then they could portion out that additional food to the people. So all of this indicates a really, really obvious and well-known method of really maintaining a fantastic new organized civilization. What we also know is that about 1500 BCE or so, a new wave of people came. These people were Indo-European, which means that they eventually emerged out of what we now call Turkey and spread throughout Europe and also throughout Asia. So these people are coming in from the east and coming into the Indus Valley from the north, so from what we now call Pakistan. As they came in, they perhaps clashed with the Indus Valley people, perhaps enslaved them, we're just not sure. But they brought with them a specific culture, a specific religious tradition, and this culture and religious tradition is eventually going to meld with that of the native Indians and will become what we today know as Hinduism. The process for that was really long term. We call the religion that the Indo-Europeans brought with them Vedism. And Vedism, which was also known as Brahmanism, had a set of beliefs. One of those was the caste system. So society was organized along the different castes. You guys learned about that last year in world geography. The very top of the caste system were the priests or the Brahmin, right? Over centuries, Vedism begins to evolve. A language is associated with Vedism, that's Sanskrit. And over time, Vedism becomes the much more recognizable religion of Hinduism. Hinduism uses a lot of the Vedic traditions, a lot of their sacred texts, and it added to it, right? And by the time we get to the modern era, or the Common Era, what we see on the Indian subcontinent is a widespread cultural base, a widespread religious base, which is Hinduism, and a lot of political fragmentation. Right? We do have another minority religion in northern India, that would be Buddhism. But for the most part, people were Hindu, and you had monarchies and republics and all sorts of different kinds of states living together on the Indian subcontinent. Beginning in the 700s of the Common Era, the spread of Islam is going to bring successive waves of conquerors to the Indian subcontinent. You guys learned about Islam and the major tenets of Islam last year. As you will remember, Islam was born in the Middle East, and it spread to the west and it spread to the east as well, basically along trade routes. As merchants were trading, they brought their religious ideas with them. For the Muslims, they were also expanding an empire as they were engaging in these commercial enterprises. And so the conquest of territory brought about the expansion of Islam as well. For India, Islam is going to basically come in from the north through what we now call Pakistan. And in these early years, as Islam spread, Muslim conquerors allowed native peoples the freedom of worship, so long as non-Muslims paid the jizya, a tax that allowed them this freedom of worship. And that's exactly what happened on the Indian subcontinent. But at the same time, there was a lot of tension, cultural and religious tension, between the Muslim conquerors and the native Hindu and Buddhist peoples, primarily Hindu, right? That's the largest population. Think about it. Think about the laws and beliefs of Islam and then the laws and beliefs of Hinduism and how these might have come into conflict. For one thing, Hindus were, from the Muslim perspective, polytheistic, and Islam is a monotheistic faith. So they're looking at Hinduism and they're thinking, oh my gosh, these people have been led astray. They worship graven images. They make graven images of their gods. And this was unheard of in Islam. In addition, they have particular practices that seemed just weird. The Hindus, as you guys will remember, maintain that the cow is sacred. So they do not eat beef. They baby cows. They do not slaughter them, etc. But of course, Muslims don't have any such restriction. They slaughter cows and they eat beef. On the other hand, Muslims don't eat pork. Pork is forbidden to them in the Quran, and yet Hindus eat pork all the time. So there were all sorts of practices that seemed very, very strange from one side to the other. By the time we get to the end of the Middle Ages, about 1500, we have a new family coming to power on the Indian subcontinent. This family is called the Mughal family. They established the Mughal Empire. And while there will be Mughals in power somewhere in India between the 1500s and the early 1800s, they really start losing power in the 18th century. The first of the great Mughal emperors is a man by the name of Akbar. Now, Akbar comes to power and he's very interested and concerned with ensuring that India prospers economically and also socially. So he really focuses on expanding India's agriculture and their mineral mining and their textile production, all in an effort to really increase India's economic wealth. Because he wants to do this for all of his subjects, he also practices religious tolerance, and in fact, he abolishes the jizya. This is the first time this was done in a Muslim territory. When he took wives from among the Hindu royalty, he did not require his Hindu wives to convert to Islam. And so his attempts at outreach really gave him an enormous amount of favor among his Hindu subjects, and they called him Akbar the Great, and they thought he was wonderful. But that wasn't exactly the way his Muslim advisors saw him. In fact, they felt he was way too liberal, that he was allowing the Hindus too much leeway in their trading and in their social lives. And they went so far as to call him a heretic, right? Someone who had turned away from the true teachings of Islam. When Akbar died, his successors began to dial back that religious tolerance. And so what we see instead is growing restrictions on the Hindu population. We can see this especially with the reign of the Emperor Aurangzeb. This is Aurangzeb right there. He already looks very strict, doesn't he? He was a very strict Muslim, and he reinstituted the jizya. He demolished Hindu temples. He forced Hindu merchants to pay a greater tax on their goods than Muslim merchants did. All of this in an effort to re-emphasize the supremacy of Islam in India. As you might imagine, that didn't go over too well, and Hindu merchants began to rebel against the government. To make matters worse, Aurangzeb wanted to conquer all of the Indian subcontinent. So as you guys can see here on the map, he starts to really move his southern border. The problem is there are Hindu rulers who still live in the south, and they fight back against this expansion. While ultimately we would say the Mughal Empire was successful in expanding their territory, it came at a really big cost. And in fact, the treasury that Akbar had tried so hard to increase and maintain was basically depleted because of these wars. And by the time we get to the middle of the 18th century, the Mughal Empire is very diminished. They're politically weak, they're militarily weak, and they don't really have any money anymore. And this allows a vacuum to exist in India, and this is a vacuum that other people are going to come in and try to fill. One of the big problems that India faced during the Middle Ages was the persecution of those who weren't in power, right? And we have a Muslim empire in power, and we know that they're persecuting the Hindus. Well, they were also persecuting other peoples that they felt were outside of their political agenda. Buddhists were some of these, but among those people who were persecuted was this relatively new group, religious group, known as the Sikhs. Now, the Sikhs started out as peaceful farmers in northern India who had developed their own ideas about community and about religion. In some ways, these ideas were very similar to Hinduism. In some ways, they were similar to Islam, but they were neither Hindu nor Muslim. And that, of course, was the major problem. Sikhism was founded by Guru Nanak, who died in 1539, and this is Guru Nanak right there. He focused on a monotheistic belief that there is only one God. He is the creator God, he's the sustainer, he's also the destroyer. So when you're looking at some of those terms, that is very much the way that the Hindus speak about some of their gods. The Sikh god is called Hukam. Now, he is one God, so this is monotheistic. The Sikhs believe that God could not take a human form. They also believe that the goal of human life is to break the cycle of births and deaths and merge with God. So in some ways, this seems kind of like Hinduism. They believed, though, that in order to do that, you had to follow the teachings of the Guru, to meditate on the holy name of God, and to perform acts of service and charity. So the path to salvation was a little bit different from what we see in Hinduism. Additionally, they believed that you emphasize daily devotion to the memory of God. There isn't a special holy day because every day belongs to God. They rejected all forms of what were called blind rituals. In other words, they didn't fast. They didn't practice vegetarianism in a religious way. They didn't believe that pilgrimages gave you any sort of benefit. They disavowed yoga as a way towards meditation. So they really moved away from both Hindu and Muslim ideas of religion. And in fact, what the Sikhs focused on was the love of the divine name and dedicating one's life to God. Guru Nanak reportedly wrote, quote, "Realization of truth is higher than all else. Higher still is truthful living," end quote. And that's really what the Sikhs tried to accomplish. Now, the problem was that they were seen as this political breakaway group by the Mughal Empire. And so they were persecuted. And as a result of that, the Sikhs found that they had to practice a military discipline so that they could protect themselves and their lands. And this military discipline organized into a military order that was both religious and militaristic. The military order was known as the Khalsa, or the Pure. And what you guys see here in the image is some of these soldiers who are going off to battle. Now, the Sikhs ended up becoming really one of the best known of the military orders in India. So much so that they're going to play a pretty major role in the next chapter of Indian history.